Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Polarizing Conversations. Today I have the pleasure of being joined with Ivan Okello. He's a first generation immigrant from Uganda in East Africa, currently based in the Siknikt district of the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, a city colonially known as Moncton, New Brunswick. Ivan currently serves as the project manager of anti-racism initiatives at the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, also known as NBMC. He is an educator and storyteller who believes in using education as a medium for bridging social inequities and to advance social change. His goal is to live in a society free of injustice. Ivan's educational background includes gender studies, international development, and anti-racism and decolonization. He has previously worked in post-secondary institutions and nonprofits. He's passionate about building bridges across diverse communities and ensuring that society and organizations are designed and redesigned to serve and cultivate everyone's potential. So, Ivan, how might we create anti-racist futures?
Wow. First and foremost, thank you for having me for this conversation. I have been passionate and engaged in this work for quite some time. But for me, really, it goes back to my earliest relationship, which was really with my grandmother, because I've always felt like she was the first person that instilled this desire for equity in society, but also this desire to create equitable futures for everyone. And I think based on just her treating me as an adult while I was still a child was actually one of the things that has shaped my relationships with people, but also my desires and aspirations with people. So I think to answer your question, to create anti-racist futures really means seeing everyone from an equal place and giving them an equitable outcome. And I think that's something that in every aspect of life, I have really, really had a strong desire to maximize my own potential as well as the potential of other people.
I love that. I have two questions. The first one is about your grandma. Thank you for sharing that. I had a similar experience with my grandma. She passed away over a decade ago, but at her funeral, I said that I had never heard her say a bad thing about anyone, which is true and remarkable because, I'm not sure that most of us could say that. But help me understand a bit about how that relationship really shaped your future in more depth.
Well, I think for me, it was really the sense of autonomy that I got as a young boy. And I think knowing that not many parents give their children a sense of autonomy. I think, society has cultivated this idea that, parents are generally superior to their children. And when those children become adults, they become superior to their children. And I think seeing that I was raised with having a sense of voice and a sense of participation, with my grandmother. And that depth of relationship really allowed me to see adults as people that could create conditions for safety and equality for children, and also for me to create those conditions of safety and equality for other people. But I think for me, it was also knowing that my grandmother was the first person that actually thought was a feminist, but I didn't even know what a feminist would mean or look like. But thinking back, I thought she was like the OG, like the original grandma that was just so cool. And everyone was like, you know what, this is and I think the thing that struck me the most about her and how she related with people is how she seemed to inspire, especially women and young women, to go to school, and knowing that this was an idea that was very much, neglected within like the social norms in Uganda, but also just the idea of women being significant participants in society. And I think she was one of those people that was really strong in her advocacy for her daughters to go to school and her nieces to go to school, and for everyone really in the family to have an education as kind of the foundation for a successful life. And I think our personal relationship really, really grew upon her instilling me a tremendous amount of education. And I think that is actually one of the reasons I felt like the education that I got from her was really the education that I needed for a lifetime. That when I became 18 and I had to leave to the cities, I felt I had the tools that I needed to navigate, that society. And yeah, but unfortunately she passed on in 2017. And I had actually seen her a week before she passed. So it was a really challenging moment too, to realize that this source of inspiration had kind of carried on. But also I felt enormous drive to really continue to live her legacy and set the example that she had shared with me up to this point. So yeah, I think, I have really, really fond memories of her. And I think she's one of the really inspirational people in my life, from a young age up until this point. So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that we had briefly chatted about was, how each of us can take individual actions in creating an anti-racist future, or just more generally, a more equitable future. And I think what you just shared about your grandma is an example of that, of how we as individuals can make what might seem like on a day-to-day basis small actions, but can ripple out into different communities because you chose to leave Uganda and to come to Canada. And I'm sure at the time she would have never been able to know how far her impact would reach. What do you think gets in the way of either maybe people like living this out on a day-to-day basis, or just generally in creating that anti-racist future?
I think from my experience, I would say it's fundamentally two things. And for me, the one that I've come to see as the most challenging is tradition. Because, and tradition is really the belief that this is how things have been done. And this is how things have always been done. And I think that, in itself has given us a sense of comfort that tradition and the ways of tradition, can accommodate the needs and also respond to the inequities of our time. And I think, in all fairness, that has consistently been untrue, because if you go back to the time when women needed to get out of the household and go on and vote or go to school or become involved in political, affairs, the traditions of the time actually argued that they shouldn't do that. And I think knowing that at every point in time, whether it was bringing about racial equality in North America, and knowing that the traditions was like, no, there shouldn't be racial equality. And I think one of the things that every individual almost seems to embrace is, tradition as being such a powerful, determinant of our life. And yet it's also one that we should continue to cross-examine, because I think more and more there is such a huge amount of limitation that comes from embracing tradition without question. So I think for me, that would really be the number one. But also I think there's just a sense of desire for more, to create an equitable society, but there's really a lack of vision on what that equitable society looks like. And I think we've had opportunities to have really impactful visionaries, for instance, like Martin Luther King or Simeon Beauvoir, that their own writing really, really showed the public the imagination of what an equitable society looks like. And I think it really did a good job to transfer us from the present state and say, imagine a future like this. Imagine a society like this. And I think that really allowed us to imagine renewed possibilities that were so different from what our current realities were. So I would say those would be the two fundamental, limitations.
Mm, yeah. What is your vision for a more equitable future?
I think for me, my vision really goes back to my relations with people. And I think considering my immediate relationships, for instance, with women in my family, I was raised by my grandparents, and I have seen a tremendous amount of love and care from my grandparents, but also knowing how I related with them and how they've continued to instill these ways of living for me to relate with other people, no matter their age, no matter their background, no matter their race. So I think my vision is really a future where the individual humanity of people is seen before, the perception of who they might be, and whether that is by their gender, or by their sexual orientation, or by their race or expression of religion. I think for me that is the kind of society that I seek to aspire to have. But at the same time, I feel it's more and more something that I can create within the relationship that I have. And I think whether it is a relationship that I have with you, or it's a relationship that I have with my partner, or the relationship I have with my neighbor, I think there is such a collective strength that comes from expanding those relations and creating equity in those relations, and using that as really the inspiration for an equitable society.
Yeah, I love that. I've been following young Pablo. I don't know if you've read him. He's a poet, and yeah,
Yes, I have.
yeah. And my favorite very short poem is it goes, to harm another is to harm oneself, and to heal yourself you heal the world. And I think I've been thinking a lot about what you've just mentioned about, how we contribute to that future that we want is through each individual relationship and each individual interaction, which is at times not easy, especially if we're tired or stressed or whatnot. How do you think about, if we were to pull on the thread of what you were discussing around tradition, tradition being important for a lot of people, and there's lots of traditions I'm sure that we could argue are helpful, and some that maybe, as you say, could be questioned. What advice or what thoughts do you have to share with people as they think about navigating their own traditions in their life or in their culture?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's a question that I would really encourage everyone to ask, especially knowing just how different traditions shape our own realities, but also our own sense of community. And I think if you think of traditions within the context of building communities, that's really where I think it's relevant for us to think of what are the traditions that we practice that exclude other people. And I think if you think of it as an example of Christmas, for example, it's arguably the only 10 days or so a week across the world where everything, comes to close, and everybody gets to express, their religious, affiliation, whether it is having a family dinner or purchasing gifts for family members and all of that. But one of the things that is not really, really discussed is how a tradition like that, for instance, puts certain communities, on the other end. And I think when it puts certain community members at the periphery of society, where they do not get to exercise the same level of, religious congregation through the time of the year. And that would be an example, for instance, of the Muslim community. They fast the whole month, but they may not get as much time to congregate outside of the work, routine. So I think for me, one of the things that I would encourage people is to reflect on the traditions that they express, but also who is othered within those traditions. Because I think that's really where the message of inequity often arises, and where there's a desire to build equity. Because I think once we determine what those are, it's actually much easier for us to create space for dialogue, or to create space for participation, or to create space for inclusion, by just identifying who is not a part of the conversation, or who is not participating within the tradition. And I think more often than not, we can see that low income folks that do not have family, or newcomers that are living abroad, distant from their families, are excluded from those traditions, however beautiful and collective they are. And I think my experience living in Canada, for example, has enabled me to really appreciate how Christmas as a tradition is also one that actually I can build community. So, for instance, if I have folks that are from different nationalities or different faiths, that is often an invitation for me to say, this is the time of the year where we congregate with family. And while your family is so far away, how about you congregate with us? And really, be the community that, would have been there for you had you been in your home country, or had you been, in your hometown. So I think that's one of the ways that I've always thought about community, to attach tradition to a way of building community, as a way of also building bridges with folks that might be from different communities. Because I think there's a lot of closeness and cultural exploration that comes from being able to explore those opportunities. So that's actually how I think we've been able to do it, but also to be able to expand our own circles of community beyond the traditional folks that look like us, or live like us, or act like us.
Mm. There's so many questions I have. I think I will ask you, as it relates to inviting in people who are not like us. I think there's an element of curiosity about other people, whether they look like us or not, and maybe acknowledging that everybody's on a journey that at some level, like, we can never fully understand. What thoughts do you have for people who are maybe at like the beginning parts of their journey of thinking about these types of things, whether it be how can we be more inclusive at Christmas holidays? Because as you mentioned, in Canada, it's a time when a lot of people have time off from work, um, whereas other people might be observing their religious or spiritual holidays at different times of the year.
I would say for me, I think the first step is really to really move beyond, I think, the internal self-regulation. I think anyone that is going to venture into engaging with a community that we're not familiar with, our first barrier is really that fear of taking the first step. And I've seen so many instances in my own life when I met folks from very different backgrounds that I felt a certain level of fear to engage with them, from the beginning. And one example was really me as an international student living in Halifax, really not knowing much about like the indigenous history or the indigenous communities across Nova Scotia, but also realizing that I wasn't sure how to engage in a conversation to say, hey, what are you having for lunch? And how do you harvest that? And is it something that is a cultural tradition in your family? And is it something, and knowing that when you do it, it really opens up this well of information and exploration about someone's life and someone's life story. And I think, as you mentioned, there's a curiosity that goes into it, but I think there's also just a risk to really explore the unknown, which is to say, who is this person that I do not know, that there is so much I could know about? And I think just knowing that as a potential opening is something that has opened me up to so many amazing friendships and relationships, because there's just a sense of the unknown that could be potentially known, that becomes this exploration of who someone is and what is their life about and what are their priorities about. And that has really opened me up to really, really interesting friendships, but also a really, really unique understanding of the world and the stories that people share from the communities. So I think for me, the first thing is to really examine that discomfort and really be able to step up to the moment and say, what if there's so much more that I could know by exploring this? And I think that's really when curiosity runs its course and opens up all these moments of connection and all these moments of cultural bridging and connection that just provide you so much joy at the end.
Yeah, I want to pull on the thread of the risk. I like how you frame that. That sometimes we have to take these risks and reaching out to people, just in general in life, and that can feel scary.
Yeah.
What thoughts do you have on that and confronting the fear? I know you spoke a bit about it, but I'd love to hear some additional thoughts.
I think for me, the risk has always really come also from my own cultural upbringing. I think the thing that I found really different, for instance, living in Canada compared to Uganda, was that in Uganda, I spoke to everyone on the street. If I met someone, whether they were carrying a child on their back or riding a bicycle or, like holding their animals on hand and taking them to graze, could never walk past them without saying hello. And that was just such a cultural messaging around the open conversation within community that I noticed that I started to reserve myself culturally when I moved to Canada. That I was able to kind of say, should I say hello? Or what if I say hello and they do not reply? And I think I've had a few conversations, for instance, with my partner when I say, you know what, like, they're like, you always say hi to people. And I'm like, I do. And whether they say yes or no, or whether they reply or not, I still do it anyway, because I think it's such an invitation to connect. And whether that invitation is taken up or not is just something that I think is such a norm that I have, and I would encourage other people to have, because the opportunity that lies in someone, it's almost like when you're playing tennis, that if you make the first like try, and you bat the ball to the other court, they could return it. You might have to walk over there and pick it up. But at the end of the day, you making the first attempt is such an opening that you don't really know how far it could go. And I think for me, it's knowing that that risk has always presented so much opportunity. And I think I've always really looked past the risk to the opportunity, whether it is for friendship or it's just one conversation by the bus station or it's one conversation with someone, like walking their pet. And I think seeing it as opportunity really, really allows you to look beyond the risk and really start to explore what it could be. So, and that's something that I feel has been so rewarding for me. Like every other time I talk to someone for 5 minutes because I just said hello, what is it you're eating? Or what are you doing this summer? And knowing just how much conversation comes out of that has been something that I find so rewarding.
Yeah, I love that. I've always appreciated my conversations with people either on airplanes or, as you know, I do a lot of hiking and talking to people
Yes.
randomly in the woods and things like that. So yeah, I appreciate that. I'm wondering how all of this relates to the work that you do at the New Brunswick Multicultural Council.
Well, it relates in so many ways. And I think for me, the arguably the most important skill that I've had to bring to my role is really being able to connect with people from a place of common ground. And I think that has come from really me being able to understand the commonality in the human experience and the commonality within the human need, and whether it is for community or for self-fulfillment or self-actualization or really seeking opportunities for growth or seeking a sense of belonging. And for me, really, the main connection has been that there is that thread of community that everyone is seeking to become a part of. And I think knowing that whether it is newcomers coming into, New Brunswick, whether it is, community members looking to connect with newcomers and make sure that they're settled in, or it's different organizations that are looking to have folks, get employment or volunteer in the communities. I think the common thread has been communities trying to show up for one another and be the like the bridging gap to the needs within the community. And I think that's something that I've seen continuously in my work, and also the level of collaboration that comes from that. And I think I am big on collaboration because I think so far I've really seen how communities have such a strong desire to bring positive change, and whether it is to create anti-racist futures. And I think sometimes knowing that communal commitment has come from a lack of trust or a lack of agency from our like public institutions to create the conditions of that change. So I think there's a lot of power in community, and my work is largely driven by really meaningful folks in the community that really want to see the change, no matter who is acting on the other end of a government or an organization. And I think that's really the common thread that allows me to do this work, but also allows me to see the humanity of people on a daily basis, whether it is in terms of their need or in terms of their aspiration or in terms of their desire for participation or to belong, which again is a very, like binding theme, for me personally, but also for other people.
Mm-hmm. I've heard people say that they don't really believe that equitable future is possible. And maybe that comes from a place of recognizing that there's still so much work to do. What would you say to those people? Or to, I mean, maybe it's not to those people, because I suppose we would all have a little bit of that in us somewhere, the ego part or the fear part. But maybe I could reframe the question as, what would you say for people who want to believe an equitable future is possible but aren't quite sure that it's safe to believe that?
I would say that first and foremost, I like to say that I am a very realist optimist. So I see the potential, in the future, but also I see the realities that exist. And I think this is something that, to tell different people in terms of what they experience, that when it comes to, addressing inequities within our communities or to create anti-racist futures, it has to come from a place of believing in the potential of people. because I think that in itself has so much, runway and so much capability that if you believe in the potential of a 5-year-old going to school, or the potential of a newcomer that has come to this community for 5 months, or you believe in the potential of a community to really excel in its, in its goals, I think that in itself has to guide us to be living in an anti-racist future, because there's all this exploration and possibility that comes from that. But at the same time, there's folks that have been dealing with historical marginalization, or removal of opportunity, that might feel like this is actually something that is so distant, or it gives them a sense of false hope that they cannot achieve. And to those people, I would say that it's realistic. We cannot deny the reality that those positions have not happened, or the circumstances have not existed. But I think it also comes with acknowledging that there's a truth to that, and there's a truth to creating a future imagination that can still lead us to a place of seeking, new realities. And I genuinely do believe that new realities are possible, because if you go back to creating, for instance, like having women involved in the workplace, I think if it wasn't for World War II and just the desperate need for labor in the workforce, we wouldn't have seen as much representation of women in the workplace. And I think knowing that sometimes necessity within our society shows us not only the gaps, but also the opportunities for folks to be involved. And I do see that there's always those opportunities for more folks to be involved. And yeah, but it's also difficult if the realities of some communities are so deprived that it's hard to see these anti-racist futures, or it's hard to see, collective futures that are actually more equitable, and we cannot deny it entirely as it is.
What do you see as the biggest opportunities in society today?
For me, I would say the biggest opportunity right now is in our youth. And the reason I think it's in our youth is because there is such a desire to create more than what we already have, and there's a desire to move beyond the traditions that we've embraced for so long, and there's a desire to reframe the narratives that have been perpetuated for so long. And I think our youth have the greatest agency to make it happen sooner. And I think, many folks, whether it is regardless of their age or their background, I think their own perception of when that should happen is sometimes a bit more extensive or a bit more flexible. But the strongest agency comes from our youth. And I think that is really the biggest opportunity that exists in creating not just an anti-racist future, but and like a socially conscious future, but also an environmentally conscious future. And I think that agency is so evident in our youth in terms of how, determined they are to create it, now and not later.
Yeah, I love that. And I like that you pulled on the element of, an anti-racist future is probably a more gender equitable future, a more climate friendly future, and all of these things. And I think that that circles back to potentially like the conversations that you had with your grandma earlier about recognizing the individual humanity of another person, but also um, just having respect for all living things.
And a lot of it for me, I think, comes down to really seeing how there is such an intimate connection between, us as humans, but also between humans and the planet. And I think that is something that we've seen a growing polarization between not just communities, but also communities and the planet. And I think that is something that, thinking back to my conversations when my grandmother would harvest, natural fruit in nature and say, "Oh, I got this on my way from the market. You can have it." Or, you could take this to school and share with some of your friends. I think seeing that level of intimacy between how we interact with nature, but also how we interact with people, but within this universal sense of connection, for me was such a powerful thing to witness early on. But I think more and more it's becoming very polarized and also very siloed conversations, that when you're talking about the planet, you don't talk about the people. If you're talking about the people, you don't talk about profit. And if you don't talk about the profit, you don't talk about the planet. And I think that is creating a loop of opportunities for misinformation, lost opportunities for dialogue. And I really, really see that there is a strong opportunity to create moments of connection between humans, but also between humans and the planet, and creating it with with justice in mind and with equity in mind, but also with a sense of a desirable future, a collectivist future in mind.
Yeah, that's so powerful, especially as I think about what you said about having these conversations in silos. And sometimes it feels overwhelming to think about how we can remove these silos, um, especially with the speed of information and everything happening so quickly, and reduced attention spans and all of these types of things. As it relates to maybe either your work or your personal experience creating anti-racist futures, what thoughts do you have for folks to have these conversations in a non-siloed or holistic way?
Well, that's a difficult question, but also one that is actually very urgent. And one of the things I would say, I think for me, I would go back to really telling it in form of a story. And I think it's really through, for instance, the story of my own journey, immigrating from Uganda, to Canada, and actually building, my career within this work, but also seeing the level of need, but also the level of opportunity that is out there. And one thing that has struck me throughout all this time has been how there is so many interest groups. And within those various interest groups, there is also a lack of desire to create collaborative partnerships. And I think for me, the thing that has emerged from all of it has been really knowing that it's often taken very few agitators in community to say, you have this interest, I have this interest, but here is the common interest. And I think the folks that identify that common interest have been really the bridge builders. And one thing that I would really, really want to believe is that it's the bridge builders that are going to take us to an anti-racist future, because based on the polarization that we're experiencing, it's the folks that see the connection between, gender equity and environmental, justice, or the ones that look at, creating, financial equity and community justice, and being able to kind of connect and say that if capital works for the people, then those people will take care of the planet, and that planet will take care of our capital that we need, and then that capital. And I think there's a cycle of connection, within all that. And I think the folks and that is one of the things that I try to articulate in my work, that to create an inclusive workplace, you have to invest in people. And when you invest in people, they will invest in that company, and it will bring the profits that you invest back in the people. And I think there's a circular economy that exists, but not everyone has tapped into it. And whether it is within our school system, to tap into the potential of youth to be involved and to create, equitable spaces in schools, or in the potential within the workplace to create, conditions of inclusivity within the workplace, or even investing in our communities and creating that potential of exchange and reciprocity and investment within our communities. So for me, I think really the bridge building and the collaboration is really is the way of the future. And one of my hopes is to see government as an active, collaborator in this work, because I think the communities are already doing it out of a desire to improve the conditions within the community. But I think seeing at different levels of government would have such a crucial stake to create this anti-racist future, because we the people are the government, and we have so much trust in government as an institution, but also as a tradition in our society that maintains and provides so many critical services.
What's one idea that you'd have for a government, whatever level, to play, I guess, a key role in this? If they're, I understand that they might be already, but something that they're maybe not doing that you'd like to see happen.
Well, for me, the one thing that I would like to see from a government point of view is to really create opportunities to invest in specific communities. And I think we've seen a growing amount of that in the last, 3 years so far. And I think knowing, for instance, just the return on investment on investing, especially in either marginalized or underrepresented communities. And the reason why I think that is really important is because there's never been a better time to invest in these communities, especially if you look back to, like the historical path that has led us to where we are, but also knowing just the desire to undo those injustices or the desire to recreate, collaborative futures, but also just the desire to participate. I think for as long as I remember, I thought that, government was a detached institution, from me. But I think knowing now that I am such an active participant in community, but also in shaping, the community's trust in government. I really, really believe that being able to invest back in those communities is really the way of the future in terms of creating an opportunity to have an active voice on the table, but also an opportunity to actually create, opportunities for other people. Because I believe that at the end of the day, even the folks in government are often our family members or our friends or our neighbors. And when they embrace that same future, like we embrace that same future in the community, there is a multiplier effect that comes out of that I think would really create a successful outcome for everyone.
Yeah, I like that. I like the framing too of the community investment. Because sometimes when we think about investment, we're thinking about money, and obviously, if you're investing monetarily, you're expecting a return, and perhaps thinking about these intangible investments. We can never know exactly where it's going to go, but we can know that it's probably going to create some good in the world.
Yes. And I think, to your point, what you've just mentioned now, I think just knowing that measuring investment and returns differently. And one thing that I've seen, especially in equity or reconciliation work, is measuring, returns in terms of numbers, or in terms of, the different measures in terms of, like for instance, ROIs. I think there's a level of return that we can witness when we ask what would be a successful return for the communities. And I think in thinking about anti-racist futures, a successful return for communities would be folks that actually can maximize their potential by contributing to their communities, and not so much being employed or being in school. And I think right now that's how we measure participation. It's that if you're employed and you are going to school, you are actively involved. But I think it's not so much in terms of how you engage in the interests of your community, which for me is a real investment, because I think that level of investment has such a continuous return into the future. The same way, my grandmother is no longer around, but has instilled with me a tremendous desire to impact other people that can only continue to impact more people, through that process.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great example, right? Because she impacted you, and then you chose this line of work, and you're impacting many others on a day to day basis. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that story. And to close, what would be one action that you would recommend people can do in their day to day lives to create an anti racist future?
One of the things that I would recommend would be to really explore the possibility of the unknown. And the reason I call it the possibility of the unknown is to really think of the potential explorations that come with investing in people that are not connected to us, are not related to us, have no affiliation or relation to us. And the reason why I feel like that is a really meaningful step in creating an anti-racist future is that it expands our cycle of influence beyond our immediate family, beyond our immediate workplace, beyond our immediate, religious congregation, to this really unknown but also unique path where you're able to bridge, the boundaries, across communities. You're able to bridge, the limitations or the variations of different experiences out there. So for me, I think that, for instance, for me being a newcomer and being able to engage with, folks within the indigenous community, by that level of connection, I get to explore this whole different reality that I would not have known otherwise if I'd not made that attempt. And the same, me being able to engage with, youth that are gender diverse, and knowing that that would have given me such a different appreciation of the realities, or such a different appreciation of really advocating for what their interests might be within those communities. And I think that is really where we start to build this thread of community that is beyond the boundaries of gender, or the boundaries of race, or the boundaries of religious affiliation, to really create this sense of community that is borderless and boundaryless, that makes us all united in our desires, in our aspirations, but also in our sense of belonging to a place and a community.
Yeah. And that makes me think of that poem I shared by young Pueblo, is to harm another is to harm oneself. And I
Yes.
mean, yeah, I mean, I think that's foundational to creating community, to realize that we are all more together
Yeah.
than separate. Yeah. Thank you for
Yes.
sharing that. Thank you so much for this conversation. So many takeaways that I will continue to reflect on. Thank you so much for sharing your journey.
Well, thank you too. And I think the thing that I would probably close on is that also to uplift another is to uplift oneself, because
Yes,
I
I
think
totally
there's
agree. Yeah.
yes, because I think there's just such a strong affinity between uplifting another person and knowing that that is also uplifting yourself. And yeah, but thank you so much for having me as well. Like, this was a great conversation, and I hope that it inspires even more conversations and more collaborations with different people.
Yes, I suppose that's the goal of all conversations, to inspire more and to go deeper. Thank you.
Yes, thank you too.
That was a great conversation. And to close it, I wanted to end by reading a short poem, or a short excerpt from young Pueblo, who I mentioned in the podcast in this week's episode. He's someone whose work I've been following for a while, and I thought that this had some interesting takeaways as it relates to our conversation today. So here it is. The world is changing fast, especially technologically. The speed at which we receive information and the views of others on our phones or screens is daunting. Forcing ourselves to have an opinion on every single matter that arises is unrealistic. It takes a lot of time to process unbiased information that can help us build an educated view on a topic. To slow ourselves down, we can simply listen, ponder, and learn more about different global situations that feels hard when the internet is begging us to jump to conclusion. There is also the ancient urge to adopt the opinions of those around us so that we do not feel left out of the herd. Even so, if we want to live in our power, we need to slow down, especially if it feels like the world is moving fast. There is nothing wrong with saying, I actually want to learn more about what is going on before I give my opinion. The speed at which technology moves is anxiety inducing, and it can set us up to think frantically, to jump from extreme to extreme. This means that the tools we use to develop our inner peace and well being are more important than ever. To be able to deal with the chaos of the world, we need to consistently tend to our inner harmony. And to do that, it is essential to hold our healing as a top priority. So I wanted to read that because I thought it really related to that conversation that I just had with Ivan about developing our inner peace and well-being, and to be able to deal with the chaos of the world, we need to consistently tend to our inner harmony. And I think once we continue to cultivate our own inner harmony, we cultivate that harmony with others, as Ivan mentioned, and that's a practice that I continue to work on, as I'm sure you do as well. So if you want to weigh in and provide your takeaways from this conversation, I would love for you to do that. Thanks so much for joining me for today's Polarizing Conversation. I have much gratitude to Inspiring Communities for supporting season 1 of this podcast series. If you like this episode, please share it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you missed the other episodes, check us out at www.polarizingconversations.com. Let me know what you think. We have some exciting polarizing conversations coming up in the rest of the season. 2 more to go, and I'm very much looking forward to those. And I sincerely hope you'll join me on this journey of finding common ground on some of the most difficult topics of our time. See you next time.